Today I'm going to discuss some ongoing work that students of mine and I have been doing with the Google Ngram Analytic tool. How many of you are familiar with this tool and have used it? Okay. Then let me explain some things quickly to you. Google's Ngram Analytic tool, it's called the Viewer. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to give you results of searches using the Viewer and the psychedelic drug literature and techniques to improve these results. And as I was developing this session, it kind of blew up in my face and became really more of an issue of collecting and archiving the psychedelic drug literature, and how I, as a person who started this back in the 70s and 80s, had serious difficulties identifying this literature and trying to get my hands on it for research purposes. As we move forward to today, and all you have to do is go up on the third floor and see all the stuff laid out, and the ease of access to the literature on psychedelic drugs, to realize what a profound change has occurred over the past 40 years. An Ngram, by the way, is a statistical analysis of speech text or word text, and it focuses on N, or the number of times a specific item occurs in that text. And I'll go on and give you a brief description here. So for those of you who are not familiar, Google has digitized approximately 20 million books. It's about 15% of the printed books. The smaller set, about 8.1 million, are available for analysis with the Viewer, and that's what you're going to see during this presentation. Now, the books are scanned with OCR, optical character recognition, which when they started the process was highly flawed. If any of you have ever gotten an old book done this way, half of it sometimes is totally indecipherable. The OCR technology is improving. Google's improving a lot of things with the Viewer, so hopefully in the future, as well as with the scanning of many, many more books, so we can get this corpus up to about half the known literature, I think this might be a tool in the future that could be of some value to people. The Viewer charts the frequency of an item. The item can be a letter, a word, a short phrase, a proper name. You'll see some examples of these. In a specific language, there are about 11 or 12 languages now, and they use yearly counts in the sources where they find these words or terms, printed between selected dates, and you get to choose the dates in the timeline. It is essentially a 5-century database running back to about 1600. Of course, for our purposes here, we're pretty much going to be limiting it maybe back to the late 19th century. And as the Viewer does its Ngram analysis and comes up with those books that have the particular search terms that you're looking for, if the results return for more than 40 books over that range of years that you've identified, then they'll be plotted on a graph, and the data are normalized by the number of books published each year, accounting for the fact that in any given year there may be more books published than in other years. There's a lot of information, and if any of you want, at the end I'll put my contact information if you want the primary literature on how they've done this. And I also, at this point, will also make a statement that I realize that many people are having a very difficult time with what Google's doing, publishers and writers, and there's a lot of negative backlash towards Google as an institution. However, I think this Viewer might be an interesting tool, and if not something that Google continues for whatever reason, or you folks, particularly in the psychedelic drug literature, feel something about, we can create our own types of viewers. So you ready? First, the Viewer and how it works. It's very, very simple. You go to Ngram. Some of you will probably start playing with it right here in the room, possibly. I'll give you a little bit of a warning for most people I've shown this to. It's very addictive. You'll stay up late. The first time you try it out, you'll be staying up late at night trying all kinds of things and looking for what, who knows what. What you essentially do when the Ngram Viewer pops up, this is it right here, you enter your search words. In this case, this is an example, inflation and deflation. You choose your time frame. Remember, you can go from 1600 to 2008, and most of my examples will be around 1920, the 20th century. You ask for the corpus, the language in which you want the search to. There are about 11 languages, as I mentioned. And the smoothing function here really refers to how the peaks occur. So the lower the number, it kind of flattens out the peaks. The higher the number, it kind of peaks them up. Most people feel that around 3 to 5 is ideal. I'm being consistent all the way through. I will use a smoothing function of 3, so we don't have any inconsistencies between graphs as we go through them. Once you enter in your search words, your time range, the corpus, and your smoothing, you click on search for the lot of books, and the graph comes back like this. So as you can see, from 1920 to about 1960, deflation was much more popular in the literature, in the English literature, whereas afterwards, inflation from about 65 onwards became the more popular term in, again, the English literature. Okay? So that's the Ngram viewer. That's how it works. And what I have now is 22 figures. Some of them I'm going to go through fairly quickly because they're in other languages. I do not have a facility in most of these languages. I've had some students and some colleagues check some of the words, but I've not been able to go in depth in terms of looking at what the archive holds under the search results. The last thing I should mention, by the way, which is the really neat function, because you know Google has scanned these books. You folks, if you're looking for a book, may come upon it and they'll ask you to purchase it. Well, what we have here is, you can see along the bottom, are year ranges for actually identifying the books that have been found through the search process. So if you were curious why inflation and deflation kind of were equal in terms of popularity in these books around 1965, you can move down here if possible and click into that range, that date range, to find the books that are actually part of the analysis. And then go even further, which we haven't quite been able to do, looking at those books and seeing what it's all about. Start doing a real meta-analysis or literary analysis or any kind of analysis that you may want to find. All right. So 22 figures in a row. Some of them will be fairly quickly, though I know the speaker after us is not here. So we may extend it a little bit, but I did time this for about 25 minutes. And in some instances, primarily my reason for going through these examples, these results of searches, is to show you the problems you can face. And there are plenty. So we'll start off with the first one. What if we take our classic terms, psychedelic, hallucinogen, and entheogen? English language, 1940 to 2008, and here's the results from the viewer in the searching of that corpus. Now, the English language literature comprises about 4.8 million of those 8 million books. Okay, the 8 million books is all 11 languages. And as we would not be surprised at all, I don't think, the peak popularity of the term psychedelic, sure enough, is right around 1970. And you can see how it is. And interesting enough, afterwards, there's a decline in popularity. And then around the late 80s, 90s, it starts picking up again with a lot of the activity we've seen amongst people who were at this conference, people in LA doing the conferences way back in 96 and so forth on psychedelic drugs. So the axes are the date line along the bottom. And on this side, you'll see the percent of total books in that corpus that have these words. And we're getting down to some pretty small numbers. So just roughly what we're talking about here, on an annual basis, somewhere between 45 and 545 books have been accounted for through this search process. Okay? So we have the English corpus. Let's make it a little bit more specific to American English. Again, the results pretty much about the same. We have that peak around 1970 with the drop-off, and then the renewed interest later on in the 1990s and up through today. The term hallucinogen, a little bit of popularity, but pretty level over time. We also can go to the British English. And we see here, again, similar results with the peak in the 1970s, a drop-off, and an incredible, really, growth through the later 90s and into this 2000s, representing perhaps a lot of the activity that's occurring in this country and a lot of the books that are being written on this subject matter. If we look into English fiction, which includes both American and British fiction, again, and remember this corpus contains books, not magazines, no ephemera, no other types of things. It's just books. And I have some comments about that at the end too. So the corpus, looking at it in terms of all English language, American English, British English, and fiction, is pretty comparable. So let's try another language. How about French? So we use the words psychedelic, hallucinogen, entheogen. We look in the French corpus, same time period, and we get this peak in 1970, but I'm sure some of you in the room are realizing something right off the bat. These are English spelled versions of the French words. This is a classic mistake many people make early on in using this. As you switch from a particular corpus, a language, into another one, keep in mind that the spellings have to be in that particular language. In fact, the viewer itself is case sensitive. If you put it's set up as commas, a word, comma, word, comma. If you put a space in there, you'll get different results. If your spellings aren't correct in that particular language, you can also get different results. So you have to be very careful about the choice of search words, especially when you're moving beyond other languages. So this is pretty much a useless result, per se. Let's go to the French terms. And as you can see here, we have, again, the classic 1970s peak in the French language. The French literature that's been scanned, I believe, runs about 480,000 books at this point. And the word hallucinogen is a little bit more popular, and I think that's due to the fact that knowing a little bit of French, particularly with the psilocybin mushrooms and the discoveries of Roger Im and some of the other things that were going on, they tended to prefer that term over psychedelic, which was more of a British and American term. And you can see that here. And keep in mind, when you get these results, you can go down to those age, I haven't shown you those age ranges along the bottom here, those date ranges, I'm sorry, those ranges of dates that you can click in to see the actual books that are being counted within a particular peak or trough area. Spanish. Again, using the Spanish versions of those classic three words, same time period. And here we see something very interesting. While the word psychedelic, or the psychédélico, does have a little peak in the 70s, hallucinogens are a much more popular term in Spanish. And for the first time in all the languages we searched, entheogens actually makes an appearance. No other language base do you find that word popping up, at least with more than 40 or more book counts. Italian. Again, we have the peaks around the 70s and a seemingly similar popularity of both words throughout time, again with significant increases here in the late 90s. Giorgio Sammarini and some of the other Italians writing a lot of stuff. You see some of their books popping up when you do the click downs. And so that explains part of that. But surprisingly, entheogen, again, only in the Spanish literature. And by the way, I should have mentioned here, when we get down to these other language bases, you're really talking small numbers of books. Here, in any particular year, we're only talking anywhere from 1 to 7 books that are being identified as having that word. But remember, over time, there's more than 40. That's why it graphs out. German. And many of my German colleagues have told me that the German word for hallucinogen was much more popular in Germany through both the research literature and the other literature that was talking about it compared to psychedelic. And again, my facility in German is 0. So those of you who want to go and continue the work with this and investigate it, it would be very fascinating to understand why we see a peak here in the 1990s. And perhaps in the question and answer period, if some people have some ideas, you can share them with us. Russian. Perhaps to be suspected, given suppression. But then the popularity with, I forget his name, Kropitsky and some of the others who are doing a lot of work in addiction treatment with psychedelic drugs. And they were being MAPS supported around 1990. And some of their literature starts to pop up and escalate over time as well. So, up to this point, we've seen the 3 classic words. Psychedelic, hallucinogen, and entheogen. And you see some broad results. You see results that are very comparable even across multiple language bases and language corpi, as they refer to them. When you go down into the actual books themselves, primarily you're looking at scientific books, popular books that talk about the problems of psychedelics. That's, I think, why we have that big peak around the 70s. There's a lot of the psychedelic craze stuff going on in the popular literature. And beyond that, too, there are some pamphlets and other scientific technical reports, but no ephemera, no magazines, no other print forms, just so you're clear on that. All right. At this point, then, we realized if we use specific drug names, can we get more precise results? And so what we decided next was to put in peyote, LSD, and psilocybin. English, Corpus, time range 1920 to 2008. And again, LSD, that 1970 curve, completely overwhelming the other two drugs in terms of the popularity in the literature. Not surprising, perhaps, to us. Peyote, with a little bit of an increase as all kinds of interest in excuse me, psychedelic medicines took place for the first time in the late 60s and 70s. And even back in the 50s, of course, you see the activity of the forefathers before these substances were made illegal, and the work that they did in Canada, America, here, and elsewhere, and over time. And by the way, for these words, peyote, LSD, and psilocybin, the number of books per year ranges from around 104 to over 1,800 per year. So it seemed to be a much more precise way of identifying the psychedelic literature than using those broader terms, psychedelic, hallucinogen, and entheogen. I should have also mentioned, you can imagine the word psychedelic is picked up in those peaks in the 70s, but a lot of what's being picked up is reference to psychedelic art, psychedelic clothing and fashion, the psychedelic mindset. It doesn't really have much to do with drugs. It's more the larger phenomenon of the psychedelic activity of that time period. So that is English. In the French language, these three terms, again, you'll see the popularity of LSD, peyote, and also psilocybin. And down here, we really see a lot of the activity of Roger Heim, the French mycologist who was identifying a lot of the different species and then sending the species off to Albert to extract the active compounds and to verify that, in fact, they were psychoactive mushrooms. In Spanish, we have, again, the 70s peak for LSD. Peyote, many more Spanish researchers were involved in peyote research, and also Spanish anthropologists doing a variety of work. So their works you can find when you do the drop down into those specific books that exist. Psilocybin, pretty flat here. And remember that peyote is something that's been around a lot longer than the classic, what we might think of as classic psychedelics, or the new psychedelics, the LSDs and the things extracted in the 50s and 60s. And back here in the 30s and 40s, these peyote peaks that you see really represent that early research of Schultes and some other explorers. Can't remember their names now. But anyway, some of the others, anthropologists who would go out, Stewart, and a lot of the others that would engage with the native tribes in the southwestern part of the US and into Mexico, collecting information about peyote rituals and so forth. Italian, again, the LSD peak. But here, what's interesting is the LSD peak is back in the 50s. And again, my facility with Italian is very poor. So a couple of students have told me that there was a lot of activity in Italian research hospitals, just like in Canada with Humphrey and Osmond and a lot of the others, investigating the value of LSD in a variety of conditions. And it does come back to peak later. The Italians seems to be a lot less interested in the other two substances in terms of actual, in terms of the popularity of the words in their literature. So again, I got to caution myself and make sure you don't realize this is not just the scientific literature, but it's what you also see in the popular or the cultural literature of those periods in those particular languages. German, Again, the peak at around 1970 for LSD. Some sporadic interest in peyote over time. Not so much with mushrooms. Bless you. And here's an interesting one again, the Russians. Not much interest in peyote and psilocybin. But LSD, and guess what? You'll see something down here. 1920s, when was LSD discovered? Well, not in the 20s. And a couple of Russian colleagues, they didn't spend a whole lot of time because they thought it was kind of a screwy project, but they decided to go in and help me. We're finding that remember LSD can be an acronym. So when I've got peyote, mescaline, psilocybin, some of those kinds of compounds, specific drug names, it becomes very precise. When you run into an acronym for a drug name or a shortened version, abbreviated version of it, you start running into problems. And these are actually political parties and crazy things going on back in, right after the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution and all that. So there's a good example that don't just assume by looking at the graph that, hey, maybe the Russians discovered LSD before Albert did, No. You have to go back into those books that represent the items found and really tease it out with a person of native language to see what's going on. All right, let's get a little bit more specific even. Ayahuasca, caapi, yaje, and yaje, two different spellings. In the English language from 1900 to 2008. And again, you can see a lot of activity here from the 70s through the mid-80s. And we know of all the folks who are doing exploration into the Amazon and studying these compounds and the native groups that use them in ritual purposes. This little blip back here is really the Beat Generation and the early thing with Ginsberg and Burroughs and all of them, finding out information from anthropologists and some others about the existence of these, of ayahuasca, of caapi, but to be used as in the various rituals. And there's even the terms itself even go further back in time before there's scientific designations in old anthropological studies that are dug up even back into the early 19th century. And how about these? Iboga, ibogaine, Salvia divinorum, and salvinorum A. A really incredible peak here for ibogaine from 95 to 2005, representing the work of Latsoff and all those guys trying to investigate that as a potential compound to help with various forms of addiction. There also is, ibogaine was very popular back in the 60s. In some of the Beat Generation and some of the other countercultural works that were identified. But they had to be fairly popular countercultural works. And that's going to be a point I'll have at the end. So these, and by the way, these represent between about 2 to 21 books per year. So this one right here is about, in 2000, 21 books had mention of ibogaine in them. All right, how about a comparison then? You've seen some graphs, you've seen some interesting things for the psychedelic drugs ourselves. Yeah. So in this one, what I decided to do was we have the psychedelic. You can see the peak in the 1970s here. It's this blue line here. The green is, or excuse me, the red is hallucinogen. And I decided to compare them with 3 very popular other types of drug names: tranquilizer, narcotic, and antibiotic. Well, antibiotics, late 30s, started in the 40s, the most popular drug term of the ones that you see here, far exceeding our psychedelic cousins, or our psychedelic, our other drugs. Narcotics, fairly strong too. And what was in, and I'll talk about this one right now, what you see, this blue peak down here is tranquilizers in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I'm sure a lot of you are going, wait a minute, wasn't that like the really bad time of all the tranks and Valium and Valium and Librium and all those other drugs? And what exactly does that mean? Well, we went back and looked at that and we realized here's another little interesting wrinkle you have to think about when you do this kind of search. Tranquilizer, singular. Tranquilizer, plural. Tranquilizer spelled in the British format, singular and plural. And you can have 4 different results really looking at one category of drugs. I'll tell you that this right here, the search was for tranquilizer singular, and it brought back about 204, 210 books per year, or in this particular year. If you do tranquilizers plural, it's almost 4 times as many. So then you get a good sense that in the literature of that period, using the singular form of the word was not the popular way people wrote about it. It was the plural, tranquilizers. And the same, also we did the same thing with narcotics and antibiotics and saw really different results from those as well. And again, we started off this project by looking at Prozac and Valium. So what I have here is Peyote is the blue line. And again, you recognize the interest in it, as we've seen before, mescaline and psilocybin, which is not as well, does not occur with great popularity in the corpus. And here's your Valium curve, nicely matching up with the Valium addiction of the late 70s and early 80s. And in fact, when you go into the books and the literature, in this peak area here, you do find a combination of all the lurid accounts of Valium addicts. You find the technical literature, the scientific literature talking about dependence, and so forth. And Prozac, its peak year, 2000. Came on the market about 1987, and the most popular drug ever in the world in terms of introduction and speed to an incredible peak at that point in time. And again, the number of books we're talking about here, in these 2 peak years, this one right here, we're talking about 454 books per year that mention Prozac. How about people? You can do that too. So I thought I put Albert up here with Dick Schultes, Shulgin, and Stanislav Grof. And you can see their curves. Again, in recent time, we see the popularity of both Schultes' books, as he was retiring and writing a lot with Bob Raffoff. Albert Hoffman, after semi-retiring, if you will, and then retiring, and his books coming out in the 70s, and his incredible popularity as the psychedelic renaissance returns, and everyone's really interested in these substances, and they always want to go back to him as a starting point. And then Stan really kind of takes it out on all the rest of them with all of his works. And remember, it's not just his works, but other people's references and all the books that came out talking about his techniques and a lot of his theories and ideas. It also became very popular. So then I thought, okay, we have these guys. Albert Hoffman did pretty well. Schultes, Shulgin. Well, Andy Weil. Here's his curve, and of course this was very popular in 95 to 205 when he was into his whole dieting and nutritional supplements and all those kinds of things. So he's mentioned an awful lot. But boy, you put Tim Leary in, and nobody can approach him. And Tim Leary's peak years were again in the 70s when he was escaping jail and fleeing around the world to try to not be extradited. So you can use people, and then again in this context you can check the books that are a part of the corpus to determine what proportion of them are. There aren't that many by Leary, there are quite a few, but obviously with this kind of a peak here, most of the books are about Leary, mentioning Leary and his escapades and the good and the bad of what he's done. I only have a few more slides actually, the conclusion and then some commentaries on this whole thing. So you've seen the 22 figures from the 22 searches that were done. There were many other searches too trying to figure out the best way to do these things. I encourage you to use the tool, to play around with it. You'll quickly discover the erroneous ways that you may do things, or you may soon discover that the peaks look wonderful. It looks like there's a lot of popularity about a particular drug, but when you get down to the books, they're talking about other kinds of things. Or maybe the optical scanning didn't work too good. So in conclusion, what I can say is it appears the viewer is a functional tool for determining the word usage popularity of psychedelic drugs in performing studies of historic epidemiology, mass media representations, collective memory, and the social construction of knowledge. But keep in mind what this corpus is all about. What Google is scanning are 40 great libraries. None of these books are in it. This is really the heart. Now, all of these are from the 70s. This is really the heart of the psychedelic literature back in those days, things that would have to be you know, secret codes to get a copy of it, mailed to your house in a brown envelope with no return address. The archiving of this information, which is very valuable, doesn't really occur at all in the Google database. It occurs in some others that I'll mention very briefly, but as we move forward in time as a community, you must realize that if you want the psychedelic literature to also be archived and to be able to compare it to other words and so forth, that these things need to be included. So for the future research, what I would suggest, the investigation of psychedelic literature over time in different languages by native speakers who know the nuances of those languages, particularly when looking down at the books that are being identified in the search process. Determine the types of literature, scientific, popular, underground, in the corpus for these specific search words. Perform comparative analysis of the popularity of specific drugs over time. The individuals, and there's a classic article in Science magazine that started this whole process where they described the viewer and they ran things with very common types of words. And they've come up with a term called culturomics. Is this a possible way of studying culture over time by focusing in on specific concepts, words, people, events, and so forth? And that's the push that they have. And as you can see here too, we have a lot of, these 4 books here really represent archiving, collecting the psychedelic literature into book form so that at least we have some access to them. Finally, I want to thank mostly and talk about creating and archiving the psychedelic drug literature. These are the individuals that have been very helpful for me over the past 40 years that I've been collecting and archiving it. I know there are a lot of weaknesses and how the difficulties we've all gone through. Elvin Smith and Tom Lytle really started off with the original newsletter magazines that evolved into Rob Dickens, Cypress UK. Integration, Giorgio Samarini and Herman DeVries also creating these books in tough times in the 80s and 90s, at least in America. Reagan, they took a lot of heat for producing literature, important literature for people to read, but it was very difficult for them to do. And there are book dealers like Mike Horowitz, Flashback Books, and some of the others who could gain you access to the classic literature, the old works by Schultes and Havelock Ellis and some of the others. And today we now have quite a few entities who are collecting and archiving these wonderful works for us for the future, so we know our history and we can examine our history. From the Wasson collection is now kind of sucked up into the Harvard library system. It's very difficult to access. But we have these other ones. The Ludlow Library was floating around for a long, long time. And a guy in Switzerland, and I just had a chance to talk over at Mag's bookstore, the person who put this all together. And it's an amazing collection. It's being archived at Harvard now. You all know about Arrowhead and Maps and some of these other sources where you can access some of this literature, but it's not showing up in Google. So do we maybe moving forward think about creating our own database and using engrams to search through it? And I'd also like to mention one of the best sources back in the day for finding these things, for finding these books and archiving them so they still exist today, were your local head shops or paraphernalia shops that had book sections. Once in America, they passed the anti-paraphernalia law in 1981. This disappeared. You were out of luck. And then also local used bookstores, which had a drug section. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when I was collecting, a lot of the great famous used and rare bookstores would have those sections. And probably by about 95, they just completely disappeared. You have to go into sociology, medical, scientific, or what have you. So this is my contact information, and I also want to thank folks like Elvin Smith, Psychozoic Press, Herman DeVries with Integration, Giorgio and Tom Lytle with the psychedelic monograph and essays. I think without them, the psychedelic literature would have had an as abrupt a stop as the use of the chemicals themselves in research purposes. And we've had a difficult enough time going back, collecting the scientific literature so we can kickstart the scientific and medical research on these drugs, but all the other things you folks like to talk about and investigate, history, spirituality, and so forth, those things would not exist without the help of all these people keeping this stuff alive. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.